Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. We're really excited to have this as part of the final day of this week's sessions. I'll introduce myself. My name is Crystal. I am the director of a new collective called the Nawi Afrifem Macroeconomics Collective, and we work to give a Pan-African feminist analysis to macroeconomic policy to include debt, trade, tax, and many, many more. We're really excited because today we're launching a part of our website that is really special to our hearts and really bringing together a lot of African women's thought leadership in the space. But before I do, I'd like to warmly welcome our panelists for today. And we'd really like to curate the session, not just as a panel. I know we're all really paneled out by the end of the year. So we'd really like to have a conversation, and we'd have a conversation amongst us and then open it up to have a broader conversation with everybody that's on this call today. I will start off with asking Fatima Kelleher to introduce herself along the three feminist Ps: your personal, your professional, and your philosophical or your political. Fatima.
Thank you very much, Crystal. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So my name is Fatima Kelleher. Personally, I am a Nigerian Irish Brit and a mother, and I'm someone who loves a whole variety of different, I suppose, out of the way genres of literature. So I've been completely into speculative fiction since I was a kid. And interestingly, that does play into and has heavily informed my politics at the same time. And I can speak to that maybe in a sec. Professionally, I'm a Pan-African feminist women's rights advisor. And I work now mainly on the continent, but I have also worked in South Asia and the Caribbean as well, primarily on economic development issues, challenging economic orthodoxies in particular, but I've also worked extensively in the education sector and in health. Politically, philosophically, I believe in social justice. I'm inspired and I'm heavily influenced by socialist positionings. And I think philosophically, I look at things from a very historical perspective, as well as, again, that whole speculative fiction sci-fi positioning, which means that I spend a lot of time looking at where we are in the history of humanity and what this current moment says about us. And fundamentally, I believe that, we are going to come out of this current state of human history where injustices are so prevalent, and that at some point in the future we are going to get to that space. It's not a utopian position, which means unattainable. It is actually a belief that the trajectory of human history has a lot of hope within it, and so that's my philosophical underpinning that keeps me going. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Fatima. Next on my screen, I have Kathambi. Kathambi, please introduce yourself, who you are professionally, personally, and philosophically or politically.
Hello, everybody. Let me turn on my video. Yes, I am Kathambi Kinoti. I am a feminist, social justice activist. Personally, I'm just somebody who believes in social justice and has been throughout the course of my career. I have seen where there are glaring gaps in social justice, where there are it's just been an eye-opener over my whole career of what is going wrong, and it is quoted in progress or development, or moving from third world country to a first world country, which I have a problem with the terms. So basically, I am a person who just wants better for the world, better for my country. Professionally, I am a lawyer. I specialize in public international law. And to me, it has been about public international law, working for countries that we know have already been shortchanged. So that's my angle. I just have a passion for those who are unheard, those who have been labeled various labels like third world, developing, and so on, and whose stories have never been told, or whose stories are not important, are not deemed important enough to be published, to be recognized, to be put out there. Yeah, so that's me.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathambi. And last but not least, Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Maina. I live and work in Nairobi, Kenya. I am a daughter, sister, friend. That's my personal. And professionally, I'm a cultural practitioner who works at the intersection of art and development to build inclusive societies. I've worked in the creative sector for a few years to build organizations and enterprises that cater for the marginalized and people who don't feel like their voice is heard, with a specific focus on women and the youth. And I'm happy to be here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Kathambi, and Fatima. I've given us a little bit of an introduction of Nawi, and the way Nawi works is that we work with different individuals, collectives, movements, and trying to build really trying to build a Pan-African narrative to the economy and have our own voices leading that. I'll hand over to Fatima now, because this has been a passion of hers, and it's really amazing to walk this journey with her and see it come alive in the way it has. Fatima, where was the genesis of this idea of putting together a repository, a portal of African women's thought in different ways altogether, especially on macroeconomic policies?
Yeah, so I mean, it goes back several years, I suppose. You know, I've been working on these issues overall for nearly 2 decades now, for 2 decades now, actually. This 2020 does mark 2 decades. And, you know, within that time, the thing that comes through most strongly is how invisibilized African women's writing, thought has been within many of these issues, particularly macroeconomic development issues, but also all other areas, to be perfectly honest with you. And so about 6 or 7 years ago, I started thinking, you know, what could essentially be done about that. And, you know, there are various challenges and blockages to finding existing work, but also, you know, there are gaps in terms of the areas that African women have written in or are writing in, and there are whole processes that have created those gaps in terms of, you know, women's writing being able to be published, African women thought leaders being invited to write. And so I thought to myself, okay, so what's the first issue here? If you go onto Google and you tap in a couple of keywords, you know, Africa, women, poverty, right? So that's the quintessential 3, you know, like keyword line stuff that anybody who is putting together an initial piece, you know, and I'm particularly thinking here also of students who are coming into the field for the first time. And what you're going to get is UNDP report, you know, you'll get World Bank report, then you'll get IMF maybe, and you'll get whatever. And none of these will probably have African women as the authors, or if African women have contributed, you maybe will not find their names as the lead authors. They may be kind of buried somewhere for having contributed a literature review or something like this. And that's partially to do actually with the way the internet itself is set up. The internet is a colonized space. We have to be very honest about that. It's a free space, and we are grateful to the man who invented it, who decided not to commodify it right at the beginning and leave it completely open. But the powers that be have found a way to commodify and to control everything through power structures and imbalanced power relationships. And so what you have essentially is a scenario where, if you're a large organization, you can bring in so much search engine optimization that will make sure that when those 3 keywords go in, Africa, women, poverty, Africa, women, development, your stuff comes up first. It's partially intentional. It's partially the nature of the power relationships that actually play out on the internet. And the internet is our first point of call now for research. It is no longer the local library, unfortunately, and fundamentally that has got its own issues. I'm a great supporter of maintaining public libraries within communities, but the reality of it is we go to Google primarily, and I am name checking them specifically, not because I think that they're amazing, but to actually demonstrate the fact that we hardly use any other search engine jump off points, actually. So that's how monopolized even the process in itself has become. So anyway, thinking about all of this, what came to me essentially was that we needed first of all a platform where you could find everything, because this is the thing. You do some research, and you might drag out one piece that's hidden here, and then you might drag out another piece that's hidden there. But there are so many that are hidden behind layers. So even if it has made it onto the internet, even if it has been digitalized, there are so many layers, doors that you have to go through, I suppose is the best analogy, before you can even find that. So if we could create a platform that actually had all of these as a jump off point, this could potentially, change the face of the way we think about macroeconomics, really explicitly putting African women's macroeconomic thought processes, just writings on the economy front and center, and would be a space where you could go, you could look for themes, you could browse. But rather than being a repository in some ways, we've been calling it a repository so far, but the reality of it is a real repository, as you find in universities, etc. And even on many of our sister sites, like the African Women's Development Fund has its own repository of writing, which often will house data sets. Rather than being that, this is actually in many ways an apex portal, because one of the things that we really want to do, and this is something, Crystal, that since we started working on this like more tangibly together, you've really kind of brought out as well, is to actually decolonize what knowledge systems we consider to be the most important. So yes, there are all of the journal articles that we want to find and make present. There are all the books that we want to find and make present on the site, but there are also multiple blogs, articles that you'll find in various, what are considered less academic spaces, but which are still telling really important positions and stories on the economy by African women, which quite frankly need to be listened to and make their way as part of policy thought processes, etc. And the other aspect, of course, is that increasingly now, we are going beyond the written word, and the knowledge that you will find in the spoken word, presentations, they're the quintessential TEDx talks, podcasts, videos that are starting to be made. All of these also need to be available, because these are very digestible and accessible forms of knowledge. And a portal of this nature would allow direct access for that. So it's really a marshalling of what's out there, and an opportunity to then say, okay, where are the gaps? How can we fill those gaps? And really put a push and an onus on the need to have African women's thought front and center, particularly if we're talking about African development. I think we're all tired of reading reports by on African women's issues by non-African women, and we're all fed up with this. So this is hopefully the beginning of trying to address that.
Thank you, Fatima. Definitely, this whole idea of African stories, narratives, and for, you know, journals and books and articles that are written not by us. I think it's something to the struggle is in decolonizing both what knowledge, like you said, looks like and what constitutes knowledge, and that knowledge doesn't have to be written to be scientific or to be knowledge, but also that we are speaking our own stories and really being in charge of what narrative is out there on our lives, especially for this specific area of work and this body of work on macroeconomic policies. So moving from there, we've got Kathambi and Elizabeth, who've been part of the team, who have been doing so much of the heavy lifting to populate this Apex portal, as we're calling it now. We've got just about 200 entries now. It's a work in progress, and part of this call is to, when we, open up a conversation, to help see if we can make links and spark ideas that can help us make it better in any way. But now I will pass on to Kathambi, and I think between Kathambi and Elizabeth, there's sort of been work divided over, Kafambi's been collecting the journals, the books, the things that have been out there by Dawn, by AWID, all these organizations that we know and have been producing so much for so many years. And so Kafambi, in about 4 or 5 minutes, because we don't want to have too much time, what was your challenges? What was most interesting in your journey in trying to uncover these pieces of work written by African sisters? What was hard? What was interesting? What was really special for you in this journey?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Crystal. This has been an honor. It's been an honor to work with the Nawi Collective, because it has been very dear to my heart. Just getting African women's narratives out there, African women's stories out there, because it's been something, or, African women are always seen as the victim or the, basically being voiceless. So to have African women's voices out there has been, an honor. However, it's not very easy to find their narratives. So a big challenge was just getting the writing, getting the articles, getting the journals, getting the content out there. But, we as African women are not voiceless. I mean, we are producing, we are, bringing out information, we are producing knowledge, we are curating knowledge, and so on. But the major challenge has been, where is that knowledge? And it has been valued less than knowledge from other people. So you'll find that if somebody from another continent or another culture or another race brings out knowledge about Africa or about women or about anything to do with African women, that is valued higher than what an African woman would do. So even finding out the, even getting the content of that knowledge is a challenge in itself. But it has been great for me during this process, because I've also encountered people I didn't know, women I didn't know, African women I didn't know, and I shall definitely engage with more during this process. And so it has been kind of a difficult process in terms of getting the information, because it's not maybe what's on Google is maybe not that available. But we have a lot of African women who are producing content, who are producing knowledge and so on, and it is undervalued. It is not on the forefront of Google searches of, what you'd want to, or what's available. But that's what this repository is about. Putting forward the knowledge and the thoughts and the research on African women by African women. And so this is a very important portal. And yeah, it's been very great being part of this process. Like I said, it has not been easy to find this content, but it is it's worthwhile. It was worthwhile. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathambi. Thanks for and Kathambi's had such a long career working for all the great women's rights organizations, both globally and in Kenya specifically. I will pass now to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, you come from a cultural background, and so intersecting a more cultural, creative space with some things that some deem overly technical and very hard, financial issues. What was that like for you, and what was surprising, what was interesting? These are not issues that you usually engage with professionally, but I think living your life as an African citizen, you do engage with them. And I think you've told me that you've seen all the things that all these things talk about present themselves in very tangible ways. I'll pass on to you to give us your experiences as a cultural background and collecting more out of the box content for the repository.
Exactly. Thank you. I think in addition to what has been said about the lack of access, because a lot of the information is behind paywalls and you don't have access to journals, or you're required to pay like $40 for an article. It's also been as frustrating looking for the more non-traditional formats, whether it's podcasts or videos, because of what Fatima had mentioned earlier about search engine optimization and keywords. Because when you key in like maybe macroeconomic or feminist or economic justice, you get nothing, or you get a news report, or you get a video that was part of like a comm strategy for an organization, as opposed to like tangible information in the sense of women talking about the issues. So it's been a case of almost following the trail, where you find like Lebohang spoke about this. You type in that and then it leads you to, one and the other. So that's been fun, because I like following random trails. So that's been a lot of fun doing that. And speaking from the perspective of the intersection of like culture and development and more serious thematic areas like macroeconomics, the most exciting piece of information that I found was the workers' exhibition that was set up by Oxfam as part of the launch strategy for their 2020 inequality report, where they set up an exhibition focusing on workers' rights in South Africa, with a specific focus on mining and extractives and the role that women have played in that. And it's an exhibition over the focus was of course on the 2020 inequality report, but it covers like mining through like several decades. And it's actually available online, of course, because of COVID, not a lot of people were able to visit the exhibition. So it's been good to see how organizations are presenting, using like art and culture to also present such serious issues. And I mean, I watched the whole exhibition and I was blown away. Another thing to note has been the evolving language over the years. So far, our oldest entries from 1986, where the language really focused on like women empowerment and how we can help these women. And especially with COVID this year, the focus has been very much on women, economic justice issues, taking up space and taking back power. And I have absolutely loved like the empowering tone that I have seen in the research like over the years. So that has been the most interesting thing that popped out to me.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And that's really interesting because I think when we're in the fight and in the trenches, we don't see any progress made because we're like really up close to the problem so many times. So it's so heartwarming to see like we are making progress, even slowly, but even in terms of, you know, empowerment and what that means and the power of narrative and how we're beginning to shift it. I think it's really special that we have somebody who can, you know, look at the bigger picture and say, actually, it is evolving and there's a trajectory of it evolving for the better. So we were going to give out the link today, but we won't because we're not quite there yet, but we will give you a snippet. And so I will share my screen now just to give you a good idea, some idea of the repository and what it looks like. I hope you can see my screen. Fatima, you're the first camera on my screen. Give me a thumbs up if you can see my website. Great. Okay, so this is what the repository looks like, and we've added a few more thematic areas, which Elizabeth will talk about a bit later. But as you can see, we've got a number under Africa structural transformation, agriculture, budget, COVID, debt, financialization, monetary policy, multilateral institutions, privatization of public services and goods, tax, the fourth industrial revolution, trade, women's formal employment, and women's labor. So under each of these categories, we've curated a number of entries, and this is a work in progress, and we continue to curate. And as we said, we've got just at 200 entries up until now. So I'll go into COVID to give you an example, and I hope my internet will work with me and not fail me at a moment of, you know, yes, there we go. So here we go, and this gives you an idea of what the repository will look like. And as I do this, and I'll stop at a picture that we all thought was quite funny or very telling rather. And here, COVID, the real pandemic. And here I will pass on to Fatima to talk about, you know, give 3 examples of entries that you thought were interesting and that you would like to share with all of us. But I will stop sharing my screen now and pass back to Fatima.
Okay, great. So yeah, what we thought we could do is just give a few examples each of just examples of the resources that you'll find there, and you know, some of the thinking behind it as well, and also what it represents. I think Elizabeth's earlier intervention about how you can actually observe the change in language over the last 30, 40 years is bang on. That's also one of the objectives of this kind of a resource portal. We need to be able to document how the struggle itself has evolved, you know, what have been the shifts, you know, what have been the catalysts that have changed our narratives. And I think very importantly as well, not to lose some of that earlier writing. You know, I have to admit that there are times when I think to myself, you know, I'll come across something from the 1980s, early 1990s, and I'm like, this stuff is what we need to be writing right now, you know, and it's already been written. So there's, you know, a kind of reinvention of the wheel. So there's also an important aspect of actually, you know, understanding where we have come from, you know, who our foremothers were in this thought process, and, you know, giving acknowledgement to that. And, you know, this idea that you have to constantly reference just within the last 5 years, this is actually something that's very development driven. It is academically driven as well, but development driven as well. And it's actually nonsense to a certain extent, because there are times when you will come across the piece that lays down the paradigm that is needed from 1991, and that's the paradigm that's needed in 2020. But because of the way, you know, knowledge does get forgotten and put to one side, particularly with digitalization now, we lose that. So this is an opportunity to make sure that we don't lose that. But what I'm going to do is speak to three examples. The first one is actually what was just on the screen there, that Crystal had up, and it's by Lebohang Lepelo Feko, and it's a piece that came out, I think, in April or May of this year, called The Real Pandemic. And it's an opportunity to rethink South Africa's COVID-19 rescue package. And the reason why I want to start off with that is because, you know, this last year we have seen a flourishing and a mushrooming of many forms of knowledge coming onto the internet as a result of this pandemic from across the world. And particularly we're seeing more and more coming from the global south as well. And we have new forms and new platforms with which we can get our information out there. I think I've chosen this specifically because it also shows the ability that African feminists have to be right at the forefront of what's needed. This was a piece that came out immediately once the rescue package had been announced. It was a critical analysis. It gave a fantastic deconstruction, and it also gave a very strong propositional approach to what the alternatives could be and how we could use the COVID moment as a catalyst for genuine feminist change. And so for me, you know, that's a fantastic example of the kind of resources that we're going to put out there and make accessible and make, you know, quotable, easily referenced, so that no longer can they say to us, we can't find an African woman to do this, because that's also something I'm quite tired of, to be honest with you. My next example is by Yassine Fall. Now, Yassine Fall is a Senegalese economist, and this is something that is not digitalized. So we have logged it on the repository in terms of its title, but it's actually from an anthology. And I know this is in reverse, so you probably can't read it, but I just want to show you the book anyway. So the anthology is called Harvesting Feminist Knowledge for Public Policy, edited by Devaki Jain and Diane Elson. And Yassine Fall's piece within that is the cost of the commoditization of food and water for women. I came across this, and it was published in 2011. This was an anthology in response to the last global crisis we had, the financial crisis of 2008 and the food crisis of 2008. And at that time, there was also a lot of discussion around how that moment could be used to catalyze change. And we had some wonderful thought that came out of that, wonderful positionings, excellent research, but also, you know, to be perfectly honest, an opportunity arose at that time to marshal individuals from across the global south, as we have seen within this book. But since then, this book doesn't have a digital kind of footprint. You can find it on the internet and buy it. I came across it in a university library some years ago, and I recently bought it secondhand because I can't remember whether it was even out of print or whether just, you know, a new copy was far too expensive. So I bought it secondhand. And what was really interesting to me was when it came, as a lot of these secondhand books, it had once been in the Sainsbury Library, which is the Said Business School of Oxford University, and they've decided they don't want it anymore. So they've gone and given it, you know, to a secondhand book dealer, and now it has come to me. So the speed at which this unbelievable anthology of work, including the thought of African women in there, is now, we also have Patricia McFadden in there as well, you know, is being lost just like that within a decade. So this portal will help to make that visible, and then we will see what the opportunities are to digitalize as we go forward. But at the very least, a researcher can know that that exists as an article, can reach out to the individual author if they need to, and get a copy of it, and make sure that that thought, that knowledge, that wisdom is not consigned to, you know, a history of 10, 12 years ago. And then my final example is an audiovisual one. It's actually just an audio one. And it's a podcast starring our very own Crystal Simeone and Wangari Kinoti. And basically it's the Jali podcast. I'm pronouncing that correctly, right, Crystal? Yeah. The Jali podcast, something that has started relatively recently. And so this is one of several podcasts that you'll find in that series. And the podcast that I'm referencing specifically is on public-private partnerships. So it's a conversation between Wangari and Crystal on public-private partnerships in Kenya. And the public-private partnership space is one where we have not had enough interrogation at all in the continent. By no means. It's partially to do because the penetration is not as high as in other parts of the world, but it's definitely kicking in and it's moving immensely quickly. So the sooner we get our analysis, our analytical eyes on it, the better as African feminists. So this is an exploratory conversation around some initial exploratory research and work. And I think it's a fantastic starting point to actually understand that issue from a macroeconomic perspective, and a discussion purely between two African feminists, just two African feminists, because actually that's all we need, right? That is sometimes all we need. And I love it for that. So those are my three examples of what you can start to find. And we hope that we'll be able to find more and more examples like this to put on the repository in the coming years.
Great. Thank you so much, Fatima. I've also put a link to the podcast that you made reference to in the chat, and we will be tweeting it as well. Like we said, this is a work in progress. It's a journey. We don't really have a reference point, and so we're, making things as we go, and creating things as we go, and figuring out how things need to be, organized and what happens. And so we'd really like to open up a conversation now. Is there anything that we should include? I see there's a comment on thinking about infrastructure, and that's true. I think we had thought that infrastructure would go under financialization and or PPPs, but maybe that's something that we need to think of as having as a standalone thematic area. There's also a question of when we go live. We sort of thought of this as a peer review, like just sharing with sisters in a safe space, to see what else we can learn. Is there anything else that we can learn from? What else can we add to the portal or the repository as we move forward? We also have, which Elizabeth will put a link to just now, a Google form where we are inviting people to help us grow this portal. And if there's any, knowledge piece, both written or performed or spoken, whatever it may be, that people can contribute to through the Google form, that would be really helpful. I'll ask Elizabeth to put the link in the chat box. But right now, I'd like to we've got about 20, half an hour at least, to open up for a conversation. And we're really hoping it would be a conversation to help us grow, help us think about things that we hadn't thought about before. We're open to questions as well. But yes, if anybody has anything to say, please, by a show of hand or type it in the chat box. That would be really great. I'm wondering if it would be a good idea to share my screen on what the sections, what the thematic areas are. And I have a feeling that might be a point of conversation. So I'll just do that now as people, there we go. And so that you can see again what the sections are that we have. And just to remember that this was really focused on African women's thought. The only problem is that now I can't see the chat box. So I have no idea if anyone's asking a question. Fatima, might you help me if anybody has typed in something?
Nobody has typed any questions in at the moment. Okay. So, but if anybody wants to just speak, that's also fine. If you can, And the organizers have put in a raise hand option in there. We don't just need questions, we're also looking for advice, actually. This is very much a work in progress, as Crystal has said, and it's and we're figuring it out as we go along. So we would love to get some advice from people on what it could potentially look like, things that people would like to see on it, and and just keep it quite open like that.
I can't see anything from, I might just stop sharing my screen because I can't I'm sort of blinded. Oh, so somebody says they need access to the form. We'll give you the access to the form now. We'll just change the settings for that. But yeah. Yes, so there's a question about adding infrastructure as a thematic area and a topic. And like I said, we had initially, at least in my head, thought of it as there's this influx of public-private partnerships and mega infrastructure. And a lot of this financialization is going into mega infrastructure projects. And so that's idea that we had, but Fatima, what do you think about opening up a separate section on infrastructure? And actually, I'll also pass to Elizabeth after you because she had added a few more sections on energy, I think, and a little bit more. So I'll pass to Fatima and then to Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think so. It really depends. To a certain extent, we're being led by what we find, because I think that's important. So as we find pieces, that will then help us to understand whether or not our initial subheadings are making sense. And to be honest with you, I can see the subheadings potentially changing as we move along and collapsing some into others, etc., as well as expanding. And it could be limitless, to be perfectly honest with you. So we could have infrastructure in there. The most important thing we need to do, first of all, is to actually find the writing, the podcasts, the resources on that subheading in order to know that we can populate it. If there's enough for it to be a standalone, then that would make sense. There are so many cross references, I think, is also worth noting. So the way it works is, a piece will naturally have more than one thematic sort of underpinning, but that would, oh, sorry, my light just went out. It's okay. But that will have what that will mean is we will choose what we consider to be the primary subheading, and then we will tag all the other subheadings. So you can go into agriculture and find a piece, and that could be a primary heading, but then you would also find it in labor, for example. So, we are looking cross-thematically as well. So yeah, I think I would love to get suggestions from people, but what more than anything would be sort of roots to the work that would populate that as well. That's also what we're looking for. So if you've got pieces that you see are not on the website when it's live, please send them through to us. The Google form is part of that data collection process. But I'll let Elizabeth speak to more technically to what that would look like as well.
Yeah. And before I move to Elizabeth, somebody asked for the actual name of the book that you made reference to, Fatima. So I'll ask you to type that in the chat box and hand over to Elizabeth.
Okay. Adding to the question about infrastructure, I've actually tagged a couple of pieces on infrastructure under the sub-theme Africa Structural Transformation, because I felt that it fit within that category. But as Fatima has said, if we get more pieces, we will think about establishing a standalone sub-theme. A few of the other sub-themes I added from the original conversation with Fatima and Crystal was extractives, energy, and ecofeminism, because a lot of this, for the three sub-themes, I found a number of pieces that could ideally fit in women's labor, but I felt like they needed their own standalone sub-theme so that we can draw out also the body of work that has happened around these three areas. for an area like ecofeminism, I picked it out specifically because there's been a lot of work around like climate change and how it's affected women and their work over the last, like, let's say, in the last 10 years, there's been like quite a bit of information around that. So I felt that it was necessary for it to come out as its own sub-theme. Yeah. Oh, and movement building as well, because I mean, the work that we are doing is movement building. So it's important for us to see just how also the community has grown in the last couple of years.
Okay, I will just invite, there's a couple of questions in the chat, and I will, oh my God, I will invite Priyanthi, who had typed in a little bit about infrastructure and fleshed out her question a little bit more. Priyanthi, I wonder if you could switch on your microphone and maybe your video if you feel comfortable doing that, just to flesh it out a little bit more in terms of what you had put in the chat box.
I won't turn my video on. I'm supposed to really be at the back end, but this was really very exciting, so I just had to jump in. Yeah, I mean, very many years ago, I was struck by what Fatima said about how there were literature that existed many decades ago, right? And I was thinking that in many kind of avatars before this, I did a lot of work on transport and energy. And because I mean, it wasn't necessarily a very strong feminist analysis, but it was a very strong gendered analysis. And it came from, and because of the way we did it alongside African and Asian, both women, well, some men, right? But and so there is a book. So there is some literature that is out there, and I will send that to you. I don't know whether it is digitalized about that. And I also remember at the same time, there was something called the Indigenous Knowledge Monitor. And something called Baobab in Kenya, Baobab something, right? All of which kind of collated indigenous or local knowledge, right? And whether it was particularly from African women, I can't remember, but it certainly had very local knowledge. And in some ways, I feel very sad that all that localization has kind of been a bit like the side library book being kind of pushed aside. And I think part of that is intentional, because that some of that indigenous knowledge actually challenges the dominant paradigm of knowledge, of what knowledge is.
Yes.
Thank you, Priyanthi. I think we also have a question from, and forgive me if I pronounce this, but I'm going to try, Kaisa Maria, who's a researcher. Kaisa, if you're still online, it would be really great if you asked your question out in the session.
Yes, so I'm actually approaching from a Nordic country, and I'm a researcher in healthcare prioritization. And I'm very aware that as a researcher in a Nordic country, I'm exposed to a very limited knowledge, gray old white men mainly. And I was wondering if the portal will also include critical perspectives on research methodology, where my opportunity would be to mainstream African women's perspectives and scientific inputs in a field where the usual discussions refer to a limited profile of researchers. So when I'm not necessarily researching Africa, but there is knowledge that I could put out there and refer to.
Thank you, Kaisa. Nancy, I see your hand, or not your hand, but your comment. If you're still on. Nancy Kachingwe.
Hi. Hi.
Hi, Nancy. Welcome.
How's it?
Good.
I'm not turning my video on.
That's fine.
Even though I should be looking much better at this time of the day, since it's only about 10 than I am. But there you go. Well, congratulations. This is a really welcome initiative. I think last week when we were thinking, one of the things we were thinking a lot about in the South Feminist Futures Festival was building a new knowledge base for South feminist activism. And this is exactly the kind of direction where we want to be able to work and collaborate and put the kind of knowledge that we need, particularly that is coming from Africa, and valuing that. I did want to comment that there are some really serious knowledge gaps. So on the one hand, there's the stuff we miss, and then there's, on the other hand, there's a lot of the knowledge that we need that we don't have, particularly when you're looking from an advocacy and policy making perspective. And one of the more basic things is data. So we do not have policy that is made out of any kind of rigorous data collection exercise anymore. In the good old days of planning, and where everything got counted and then you figured out, what you needed to do. What we have is sort of a few SDG type targets, and it's actually become really problematic. One of the critiques of the SDGs that I would have is that then guides what gets counted and what doesn't get counted. And because that's what governments are going to report on. And the reporting at the international level then somehow becomes more important than being able to give decent data. So at a time when we were doing work around trade, I know this is quite long ago, you have trade policy that's not actually based on what real local production there is. And if you say how many tons of potatoes do we grow, like going around. So what are we trading? Even for the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, what goods are supposed to be traded? And who is producing the goods, and therefore how is it going to be economically beneficial? So I'm just sort of like both in sort of that aspect of an advocacy issue around what knowledge is needed, that there are gaps on, as well as what is it that we're missing that we should include. And then maybe just another point about maybe half a question, half a comment about the repository and who the target audience is, and how you're hoping that the women's organizations that actually do a lot of the engagement with government, that process of stuff moving from the repository, becoming part of that sort of advocacy process, and then being able to be translated into policy recommendations, policy agendas by women's rights. And I think that may be something where it's not that obvious that we move from the one to the other. And so maybe some thinking collectively, and all of us, around how we do that, whether it's dissemination, but also actually making it something that we can use, because there is valuable information in there. There's valuable information and knowledge. Even in the UN reports, quite honestly, I mean, there's some really good data even by the different agencies that help us just make advocacy points that are underutilized. Thanks.
Thanks, Nancy, and so great to have you join us this morning on a Friday, the last working day of the year for many of us. Julie, you put a point in the chat box, and I wonder if you're still online to say it out loud, or if you're not, I will read it, but I'm hoping that you're still here.
Hi, Christelle, I am here. Thank you so much. It's great to hear everybody speak. Congratulations on this initiative. The reason why I wrote what I did was because I'm looking back at my time as a researcher, and I thought that, I wish we had these kind of portals so that we're not referring to the well-known and northern writers and theorists. So I'm just wondering that in terms of making this portal far more accessible, not accessible, but making people aware of this portal, can we do a small, it's just a suggestion, whether you would consider doing a short campaign on making it more popular, at the same time asking everybody to kind of do a pledge on, reading up a feminist, an African feminist writer, so that, you kind of, it's not original, I have to admit, you do this for movies that are feminist movies. I think there was a campaign that's run on watching one feminist movie for the entire week, for the entire year. So something like that, which makes it more, it just spreads the awareness of this portal, and also in some ways gets more people to access it and read it and share it onwards to others. So that was just a suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Yvonne, who works with us on our digital, is actually on the call, so I'm sure she's like taking notes, and she has a plan as well. We're looking to begin to put it out to the public at the end of January, and we will have, like you said, we're thinking of having a campaign around it. But thank you so much. At least I hadn't thought of some of the things that you've just presented. I've got also Humai, I think is how you pronounce your name. And she wrote a comment about the AFCFTA. Humai, if you're still on, if you would be able to elaborate your question a little bit. I'm also doing this for people who are watching on YouTube and don't have access to the chat.
Hi, yes, I am here. Thank you. Yeah, I just, remembered what one of the sessions that I've been listening into. One of the panelists mentioned about how insane this thing is, and I don't know this area very well at all, but for me, the issue of resource grabbing is a very serious problem, and it's being seen everywhere. So I feel like, if she thinks, if those who have been studying this thing thinks that it is insane, perhaps it is something that needs to be available for those who are actually looking at the history. And this is, of course, going to affect the future. So what is happening now that could undermine the position of women and their access to natural resources. This, I think, is very important. So I thought it would be great if it was also included in your portal. Hopefully it will go viral eventually, and I really look forward to reading and learning from this portal. Thank you so much. I think it's a great initiative.
Thank you so much, Umay, for your kind words, but also for bringing up the issues on trade. I know we don't have too much time. I know Ira has graciously given us a little bit more time if we need it, but just to stop there for now and just see if Kathambi, Elizabeth, Fatima, did anyone have anything to say? I know there was some really substantive comments in there and suggestions as well. I can see Fatima nodding. So maybe I'll start with her.
So I thank you so much, all of you. I loved everything there, and I think it's already started giving us more food for thought. I love the idea of a campaign. We have been so kind of taken up with the process, the technical process of what this would be, that we haven't really had time for that really exploratory, imaginative, expansionist thought. And to be honest, we want that to be part of a collective process anyway, so hearing these ideas is great. So we will be exploring all of that. And I think a campaign like this would be amazing, reading, make sure that you read at least one, and preferably more. I think, Nancy, all of your points are, as always, completely on point. The first question regarding audience, it's again, we probably haven't done this in the most, I suppose, what's the word, like structured way, where we kind of said, we did have an audience in mind, but for me, the audience actually is anybody who dares to write on the economy, right? So if you want to have a position on the economy, if you want to talk about the economy, please do not do it without including African women's thought. Simple, right? So I don't care what part of the world you're from, if you're going to write about the economy, and it's not just about the economy in Africa. African women are also writing about the economy more broadly, the global economy and even other regions. So actually, it's just the idea that can you ensure that you no longer invisibilize African women and make that rich wisdom part of whatever it is you're going to say, and can we no longer have excuses, please, for why they cannot be found, etc., because here we are, we've given you a portal directly to find them. More politically, it's actually for African feminists themselves, and this speaks to Nancy's point regarding how we then make this part of an active movement, and that's really where we want to go with it. Once we've got that body of work in place, and that will be contributed to, the Google form is something that we want to send out across the networks so that women themselves can actually input their work. We're also looking at something we haven't mentioned yet, at really bringing to light work that at the moment is kind of in the shadows. So I have come across amazing PhDs that have not been published in journals yet, right? You can sometimes find them on the university website. We want to be able to showcase those as well, bring them into the light, and to really then take that, make it an advocacy point regarding just the knowledge itself and the fact that the knowledge needs to be there, but why the knowledge needs to be there in order to influence policy and make sure that we're not having the same orthodox narratives about macroeconomic policy being regurgitated back at us, and to ensure that feminist thought process is being heard and is being taken seriously as a form of knowledge. And so we are looking for as many ideas in order to help take that forward, and for it to be a collective engagement across the continent with African and women's organizations, and as well as individual independent activists. And then I will speak to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think that person was me who said insane. I get Crystal. That's why I was laughing as I was reading it. So yeah, I need to get a PR advisor definitely before I come onto these events. But
or not really. I think it's fine.
So let me qualify. For me, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement timeframe is insane. So there's a complexity in all of this. African economic integration is not something that I'm against, and it's not something I think most Pan-African feminists are against. And with that will come, a drop in tariffs and liberalization over time. The issue is the extent, it's the percentage, 90% of goods over 5 years, and then full liberalization, pretty much except for the 3% of tariffs that are protected within a decade, 13 years for our least developed countries. We know a decade goes like that, and the older you get, it goes even quicker, right? So, we are looking at seismic shifts. We don't fully understand what it could be because it is an internal project, but the interrogation has not been there. And yes, in terms of the portal, we will be looking for this. Now, that event that happened on Wednesday as part of the this forum actually was to initially showcase a paper by the African women's rights organization Feminists that I have written on the African Continental Free Trade area, which will be published quite soon. The final draft was just polished off recently, so that will be published quite soon. It was written with a very specific target audience in mind, which is women's rights organizations and the players within that, so that they can actually get on top of what this is saying and what it means from Pan-African feminist positioning. So as soon as that is in the public domain, it will go immediately onto the Nawi website. But actually there's an annex within that identifies gaps. that identifies gaps specifically in research. And to be honest with you, there's a huge amount of gap. So we need so much more research. So I've given some suggestions for where we need that research. And what would be fantastic is to have African feminists actively, pursuing avenues in order to get that research out there on this agreement as it essentially starts to unfold. So yes, so very much we are going to make the CFTA a part of the Nawi website, and we're hoping that enough research will come out in the next year or two where it will have its own subheading, quite frankly, within trade.
Thanks, Fatima. Kathambi, Elizabeth, was there anything that you would like to speak to specifically?
No, I think Fatima covered what I wanted to say on trade, so it's fine.
Okay. Kathambi.
Yeah, Fatima just covered everything. I don't think there's anything I need to add.
Okay. So yeah, people really like the idea of a pledge to include African women in scholarship around the world. And Hume, I really like this term. It's a sign of hypercolonialism. And I might just borrow that and use it. Yeah, I'll do a final round if there's any more comments, questions. This has been, as I do that, I'm just like, this has been really, really, really great to get everyone to think with us, and like we've all been saying, we really hope to take all of you with us on this journey as we grow. It was interesting we had a conversation on whether to put like an open call in the form of a Google form out, but we thought we wanted to try it out and see for ourselves first, like get a feel for what is out there and how easily searchable things are or not. What do people find when they do that, and then from there work out what can make it a bit easier. We will be coming back to many people on this call and beyond to get inputs. The work that Elizabeth spoke about by Oxfam in South Africa was curated by Basani Baloy, who's a feminist sister and friend. And so she's been focusing on financialization. Nancy has a long history in leading thought from the continent. And I think it's time to decolonize. I mean, it's 2020. Just the other day, I was on a group of a forum that was looking at financialization, and it was with an international organization. They gave a list of resources on financialization. All the case studies, well, 80% of them were from the African continent. Not a single African women author had contributed to that list. And I think it's time that we stop that, we decolonize that, and that we put our voices out there and speak for ourselves, instead of passing the mic. Don't speak for us, just pass us the mic and we'll speak for ourselves. I'm trying to see if there's any last comments. Otherwise, yeah. Nancy says, I think it was a comment to Priyanthi. So I'll stop with a quote because I love quotes. I'll stop with a quote by Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who wrote a book on decolonizing methodologies, research, and indigenous peoples. And she says, there are numerous oral stories which tell of what it means, what it feels like to be present, while your history is erased before your eyes, dismissed as irrelevant, ignored, or rendered as a lunatic ravings of drunken old people. And I think that the quote really stays close to my heart and really, wakes me up in the morning and gives me the energy to keep fighting, even if sometimes it seems a bit blurry in terms of like, are we doing the right thing? Are we on the right path? But I think we are, and we're in great company. A very warm thank you to Earl for putting this week together and for opening up doors for us to have this session and have such a great conversation today. I thank all of you, Fatima, Elizabeth, Kathambi. Thank you so much for walking with us, for walking together. And it's been really a show of collective action and sisterhood really on the continent. And as we grow, I hope we can keep the same energy as well. Final words, Fatima, Elizabeth, Kathambi, and we will close.
Just a thank you to everybody who came to this session, and for all of the wonderful comments and questions that did come through. Yeah, you've inspired us even more, actually. I feel so energized by some of the things I have heard. So thank you very much to all of you for starting this journey with us, and hopefully we'll have something to show you very, very soon.
Yes, thank you for all your inputs and your contributions and suggestions. I look forward to incorporating all of this and making the work even more robust and wonderful.
Kasambi.
Yeah, it's been very enriching, and I thank you all for your contributions.
Great, thank you. And as Fatima says, we're buying our own microphone, maybe even making our own microphone. I wish everyone a happy holidays. I hope we all get to really just close our laptops and get some rest, because rest is resistance. And thank you again. I will now pass back to the Aero team. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.